Good afternoon. I'm Jim Cornell, the president of the International Science Writers Association and the co-chair of the Science and Health Book Committee for the 4th Annual Tucson Festival of Books. My co-chair is Daphne Gilman, who is here in the audience, and you'll see more of her good work if you go down to Science City at the far end of the mall. We go beyond books when we talk about science here. This is one of several, actually 9 C-SPAN programs to be broadcast live from this location, plus the live stream from somewhere else on the campus. And I want to give a warning to our C-SPAN audience out there in Videoland, because we're going to be talking about blood and guts and murder and mayhem and sexual perversion, government malfeasance, medical malpractice. So you may think you've tuned into a reality show or perhaps a presidential primary debate. Don't touch that dial. You're on the right cable channel, and we're going to be talking about some serious science with some serious authors. Deborah Blum, the author of The Poisoner's Handbook, on my far left. Douglas Starr, Killer of Little Shepherds. Obviously, Douglas is the one in the middle. And Holly Tucker, Bloodwork. We're going to be doing a little genre bending, however, also, because these books are kind of an interesting mix of science, history, and true crime. And we're going to look at some real serious issues about human frailty, institutional failure, and personal courage and perseverance on the part of individual scientists and researchers. I'd like to start with perhaps the oldest crime first. We're going to go back to 17th century France, where a renegade surgeon named Jean-Baptiste Denis did one of the world's first transfusions of blood. In his case, it was from a calf to a prominent or well-known madman in Paris. Unfortunately for both the madman and others, it failed, and it touched off a cultural and political debate that went on in France for 2 centuries and has repercussions even today. The author of this work is Holly Tucker. She's a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where she is with the Center for Science and the History of Science and Medicine.
Medicine, Health, and Society.
Medicine, Health, and Society. And she's also a professor of the history of Italian and French, with a specialty in the history of medicine. Her book, which is a wonderful narrative, is just been, I was told today, has just been nominated for Los Angeles Times Book Award. The awards will be on April 20th, and it's up in the Science and Technology Nonfiction. Holly, why don't you tell us a little bit about this book, and starting off in our historical tour here.
Sure. Well, first, thanks to the Tucson Book Festival for the chance to be here and to be with 2 fantastic authors whose work I admire a lot as well. So I started writing this book several years ago, primarily as a study of the history of blood, and it soon took a life of its own. I noticed through research and also serendipity is that the first blood transfusions took place in the 17th century, specifically as a response in many ways to the discovery of blood circulation in 1628 by William Harvey. From there, people wanted to test the idea of blood circulation, so they started putting fluids, all types of things, liquor, booze, opium, milk, water into the veins of dogs, because the idea in the 17th century is that blood, and if you think about early medicine, right, the first thing you think about is leeches, right, and you also think about lancets and bloodletting. So the very idea of putting blood in made no sense to the early 17th century mind, but they needed to test Harvey's idea. The way they tested it was by actually testing the earliest predecessors, Galen, Hippocrates, who believed that blood, of course, did not circulate, but rather was the product of the digestive system. So you ate food, it went into the stomach, it got concocted and purified into the liver, into the red gold of blood, and then it made a one-way trip up to the heart, where the heart served as a furnace. Blood was burned off. So you breathe in to stoke the fires, you breathe out to get rid of the fumes. And so when Harvey came up with the idea that blood actually circulated, it was revolutionary. So the way they wanted to test that was they started injecting all these liquors into the veins of animals, because it was thought that if it made a one-way trip, the animals wouldn't be stoned or drunk, right? Because it would be immediately burned off. Well, they soon found out that that was not the case. And from there, they started to toy with the idea of then taking the blood of one species and putting it into another, and actually animal into human, which always seems quite odd. But for the early modern mindset, it makes sense, because animals don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't swear, the blood is purer, right? And soon those experiments took on a life of their own, both in France and in England. And the case that I look at in this book is the case, as you mentioned, Jim. It was the third time that blood had been transfused. The first was in a young boy who was feverish. The second was in a butcher. It was purely just to see what would happen. And then the third was the transfusion of calf's blood into a mentally ill man. The thought was that the blood would cool down the humors that floated up to his head and made him ill. Well, he died. No surprise, after the third transfusion. And what interested me specifically in this story is that the court cases all said that, well, why was there court cases? The transfusionist was called up on murder charges. And it's one of the earliest examples that we have of a malpractice case. So the French courts actually looked at the case, went into appeals, and it was determined that there had been a murder, but the transfusionist had not killed his patient. Rather, 3 unnamed physicians had had a hand in poisoning the madman. And historians have typically looked at this case and said, what in the world? But they don't look at the murder. What they typically have looked at is the fact that blood transfusion after the case was tried was banned in France, and then later petered out entirely in England. And they say, well, of course it was banned because it was before anesthesia, it's before antisepsis. What in the world were they doing? But that's not really the story in my mind. The story is, why would 3 physicians be interested in putting a man to death? Why would they be interested in poisoning him? And one of the things that I found is that the answers were really interesting and have a lot to do with deep-seated fears that science was going too far. So that's what the book's about. I went too far in telling it, but it's one of the best early murder mysteries you could find.
Thank you, Holly. We're going to come back at the end, of course, and ask some more questions. You'll have a chance to ask questions, too. I want to go back, or actually jump ahead a little bit, 2 centuries, still staying in France, to Doug Starr's book, The Killer of Little Shepherds, about a serial killer and the very beginnings of forensic medicine. Doug is an old, I should have made this full disclosure before. Almost all of the speakers are colleagues of mine, so I do have a bias about their books and their performance here. But Doug is a longtime friend of mine and a longtime veteran journalist who is now a co-director of the Center for Science and Medical Writing at Boston University in Boston. He is written for magazines that have arranged from sports, I love it, Sports Illustrated to Smithsonian and everything in between. So he's had quite an experience. And his previous book, Blood, An Epic History of Medicine and Commerce, was made into a PBS special. It won an LA Book Award. And this current book is also an award winner. It just received the Golden Dagger Award from the British Crime Writers Association for the best nonfiction crime book of last year, 2011. Doug, why don't you tell us about the origin or the basis of this book?
I should say that by the time I was finishing this book, I was having nightmares on a regular basis. It wasn't supposed to happen. But my previous book involved the history of medicine, and I was mucking around as we do, and one day I was in the basement of Harvard Medical School just going through journals about history of medicine, and I came across the case of Joseph Vacher, who in the 1890s killed twice as many people as Jack the Ripper. But he's not famous because they eventually caught him. And that's not a spoiler because it doesn't matter. And then I read about his nemesis, Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne, who was one of the founders of forensic science as we know it, and the greatest forensic scientist of his day. Now, my colleague Deb Blum had the good fortune of finding protagonists in New York City who would appeal to an American audience. I had to go to Lyon, France to find these people. And